beautiful morning and just breathtaking chance to get up there and look at that glacier. And that's as close as we've gotten all season. You know, best views of the glacier for sure. And you can just see how fast everything is changing in this country. It's really phenomenal. And I am hoping that we see a lot of whales today, but I want you to be ready. You know, as a little kid, I was about 5 years old. We lived on the ocean, you know, right on the A1A in Delray Beach, Florida. And my dad always swam before he went to work in the morning, and he came running in the house and grabbed my brother and I, dragged us across the street and said, sit on the bottom and listen. And we were hunkered down on the bottom of the ocean, these two little kids, and all of a sudden we heard this like, woo! And I came out of there swallowing water like a crazy person and like, what is that? And he's like, it's a whale. And I'm like, where is it? And he said, I don't know, I can't see it, but I heard it. And I went back under and I listened some more. We were just full of questions, you know, where did it come from? What kind is it? What's it saying? And to every question he'd go, I don't know. I don't know. And I was just, I was in love, man. I wanted to see those whales so bad. And it's rare to have whales off, you know, Florida, but really they live in every ocean of the world. And that was when I fell in love. When I used to go to sleep at night, up until that point in time, I always used to see like Wide World of Disney firecrackers kind of display as I was going to sleep, little bright sparkly lights, and now those lights were joined by whales. And I love to go to sleep at night because these whales would like spiral through my dreams, and they would be, you know, green and phosphorescence and everything. You know, humpback whales are an amazing animal. And this is a view that you rarely get of a whale unless you jump into the water and look up at it. But you see these throat pleats, and those are common in filter-feeding whales because they can expand their throat to take in a giant amount of food in one single mouthful. And these humpback whales are famous because of their songs. Now this is a whale named Magellan. And it's very rare to have the whale, a picture of the physical whale, combined with the sound that he's making. And really that's what divides up whale scientists. There are acoustical scientists who study the sound, and it takes you in a whole nother direction of study. And then there are field biologists who study the actual physical animal. And when the two can come together, then you get a three-dimensional look at that whale. And it's so fascinating. But Magellan here is standing on his head in Hawaii singing a love song. He's hoping to find a girlfriend. And it was Canadian researcher Jim Darling who deduced that humpback male whale songs, say that fast, are part of a mating ritual. And if you imagine the song like the horns of a dominant doll sheep, the song in its complexity and tenure determines the male whale's sexual prowess. Huh? Yeah. And they sing unique mating songs, you know, like the Hawaiian whales sing like Dong Ho, you know, it's all like Aloha Hoi. And then if you go to Mexico, it's all La Cucaracha. And they can change that. It's very dynamic, you know, like we had a group of Indian Ocean whales that were cruising off the coast of Australia, and these Australian humpbacks heard the Indian Ocean song, and they were like, dang, and that's a cool song. And so they started singing the Indian Ocean song and dumped their song altogether. And I kind of think that's like when the Beatles came to America in '64. Everybody forgot about Elvis. Yeah, so humpback whales are also known as winged whales because they can throw their bodies out of the water. And orcas and humpbacks are really the only two whales that do these dynamic breaches and come completely out of the water. It takes a whole lot of energy and a whole lot of torque. So while you see it all the time on the Prudential commercial, it's not something you see a lot in real life. It's a rarity, makes it really special. But why humpbacks are able to do it is they have these pec fins that are the length of their body, a third of the length of their body. And those pec fins gave them the Latin name Megaptera novaglique, which means the winged whale of New England. And they can fly out of the water and breach. It's very rare, like I say, it'll be a gift if you see it. But the breach is dynamic and amazing.
Wow! Oh my God!
I need to buy a parabolic knife because every time I film anything, I have people in the background going, "Oh my God!" And I can't shut them up. I always want to duct tape their mouths shut, but I found myself doing it too. So these humpbacks are rorquals. They have 2 nostrils, and you'll see that in their blow, because when they blow, they have 2 streams of mist going up, and that's their breath. That's their exhalation. Their lung cavity is the size of a small car, like a Toyota Corolla. So lots of times they can gather breath and go whoosh. And that's what we call a trumpet, the sound that they make. And these whales, these huge cetaceans on Earth, they were just a real question mark, evolutionary question mark for a very long time, because there was something missing. We know a lot about canids, dogs, wolves. We know a lot about equines, horses, but whales we didn't have a complete picture of until a guy named Phil Gingrich from the University of Michigan. He's a paleontologist, and he was looking for ancient fish fossils in a desert, the Egyptian desert near Pakistan, that would come to be called Wadi al-Hatam, the Valley of the Whales. And he was looking for these fish, and instead he found whales, prehistoric whales, and it was the coolest thing he'd ever found, because these whales were the missing link. They were whales that had legs and feet. And whales are the only animals that we know of that came out of the primeval ooze, crawled onto land, evolved into hooved omnivore creatures that lived in the low-lying estuaries. And after all those millions of years of work, they changed their mind. And they went back to the sea. So this is what the family tree of a whale looks like. Their closest land mammal relative is the hippopotamus, and they share some DNA with the hippopotamus. But that little dude at the top, Indohyus, is that estuary living hooved creature that changed his mind. And moving back into a salty world required as many adaptations to change back into a marine mammal as getting on land in the first place did. First thing they had to rotate their nostrils to the top of their heads so they weren't doing this all the time. They had to become streamlined. They had to lose the feet, so the front limbs became pec fins, those huge pec fins in the humpback, and the hind legs disappeared altogether, except for a few vestigial bones that are about as important to them as our wisdom teeth are to us. So they went through this amazing change. We have 2 main groups of whales. If you really generalize, you got the ones with teeth and the ones with baleen. So toothed whales, Odontocetes, are killer whales, sperm whales, beluga whales, narwhals, and Mysticetes, which are the filter-feeding whales, humpback whales, fin whales, blue whales, what we call the great whales. Now, where I work as a whale detective is Prince William Sound, which is just about 986 miles from Skagway, north. And Prince William Sound stretches all along the top of the Gulf of Alaska. And our project began in 1980 when my friend Olga Vansegazer graduated from Santa Cruz and headed off into the north to do science. She studied under one of the premier marine biologists in the country at that time, a really crazy cool dude named Ken Norris. And every one of his students is a field biologist working still today. I mean, anybody who studied with Ken is a sure wacko out there in the world of science. And she and her friend Beth and their leaky rubber boat headed for Prince William Sound. And they made their first camp. I looked at the chart, and there was a camp that said Whale Bay. Well, hey, we're going to live at Whale Bay. If that's where the whales are, we want to be there. So they put a camp at Whale Bay. And 3 weeks in, they hadn't seen a whale. So they're like, this Whale Bay is not too hot. So they took another look at the chart, and they decided on that second camp. And see the difference? Whale Bay is tucked away at the first camp. But this second camp, all these passages that come in from the Gulf on both sides, anything that swims through Night Island Passage is going to pass our camp. And it turned out to be a whale turnpike. And right off the bat, they took their first picture. That's what they were doing was called photo identification. It was brand new, hottest scientific technique out there. And what you do is you take a picture of the bottom of the whale's tail. And that's where his fingerprint is. And every whale has a unique set of objects, scars, colorations, trailing edge patterns, and that pattern stays for a lifetime. And so we can always identify this whale wherever it is in the world once we get a good fluke shot. So they were out there. That whale is named Oreo for obvious reasons. That and the fact that Beth liked Oreos. And Olga and Beth, you know, they had a wonderful time out there. And they ID'd that first year 24 whales. The first one they drove up on the back of, again, Oreo, but they got their technique down. And things have changed. I mean, back in the old days, we had Right in the Rain notebooks and cameras, single lens reflex cameras with Tri-X film. And so we'd be out there shooting months and months and months and months, you know, and we wouldn't know if we got anything. Not until we developed the film in October. And then you had to send it to Seattle. So one time they lost a whole season of film. You know, so it was tricky science and figuring out. We navigated point to point. We didn't have anything fancy. There was no GPS. We didn't even have a sonar. You know, so we were point to point navigation with charts. But things have changed a lot. Now we have a plotter, and mostly we spot whales by their blow. And this is what you're going to be looking for. And you can see in those two on the farthest side, the two nostrils worth of mist coming up. And on a clear or a cloudy day like this one, when the water is calm, very easy to see and very easy to hear. And the reason they're commonly called humpbacks is because of the way they swim. You know, they're going to roll up here. They're just here for the food. They are here to eat, baby. It's all about the food. So they are rolling through the water, preparing themselves for a deep dive. Breathing, getting as much oxygen into their tissues as they can. They arch up, they flute. I take a picture then. And that arched motion is what earned them the name humpback whale. So every group of humpback whales has its own biologist now. And if you go online after you're on your whale trip in Juneau and you get some pictures, you can go online and you can Google Southeast Alaska humpback whales, and you'll get a catalog that's full of whale flukes, and you'll be able to ID your whales with these. We have citizen scientists that help with this, and there are any number of apps now, Whale Alert, that you can also get on and find different fluke shots depending on longitude and latitude. So that's an important thing to get. So we study these individuals, and the beginning of this was to find out how many of these whales are there. You know, at the end of commercial whaling, there were only 1,200 humpback whales left in the North Pacific. So we stopped killing these whales just in the nick of time. So that was what the emphasis was. And why did it happen in the 1970s? It happened because of one person. Don't ever tell me that one person can't change the world. It happened because of Jacques Cousteau. Yeah. So people began to really have a different view of these whales. I have a long distant relative who is a whale hunter in Alaska, a captain of a whaling ship. And the way these animals were denigrated in literature, his son was a writer, and I've read all his books, and it's like you read about these awful monsters of the deep, you know, and it was Jacques Cousteau who changed our perception of these animals. And so everybody is studying censuses for about 20 years and writing papers on whale behavior, and they decided a few things, the biologists of the day. They decided that humpback whales were promiscuous, and they didn't have any site fidelity, and they didn't like to hang out together, and they were nothing like those gregarious, wonderful killer whales that lived in matriarchal pods and, you know, never left the oldest female. And we were reading all that stuff as young field biologists, and we're watching what's going on in Prince William Sound, and we're like, that's not what we're seeing. So we began a new study on associations, and I'll talk a lot about that. But going back, this was our first camp.
Oh my God.
We're in Alaska the same way you are. We had a roof over our heads. We had heat, we had a campfire, and we had a dog and a cat along. You know, but then we had kids, and everything had to change. For one thing, we had to buy a tent. And now we had to buy a wood stove, and but what's been really powerful is going again and again to the same place, returning to see how it's changed and how it's not changed. We had to get a different boat. That rubber boat popped the first year, and that cabin cruiser only lasted a little while. And so we ended up with that sailboat. Now that sailboat, I know there's sailors in the group here, and they're going to go, that's not a sailboat, that's a McGregor. You're right. It does not have a keel. It has a centerboard, but in Prince William Sound, when you have kids, a centerboard is a good thing because you can pull it up. You can drive way up on the beach at high tide, and dump all your kids and all your gear and your fuel and everything you're going to need for the whole field season on the beach, and then push off real fast and put it on a mooring buoy. When there's no gas, you can be under sail, and that's the whole first part of the season, because the only gas out there is on the fishing tenders, and fishing doesn't start until June. So we were out there a lot earlier than the tenders were. Those early years were pretty funny. That we didn't have a radio, we didn't have survival suits. The only way we could get a hold of anybody at home was we had to write a letter and mail it from Crazy Marla's lodge, and she had a bordello in Mummy Bay. And so that was always tricky too. But now things are a lot different. Our thermarests have gotten a lot thicker, and our kids have grown up. But they come home and they say, wow, we didn't grow up like other kids, did we? No, they learned to read and write living on a boat and tracking whales around. And that's why most of our whales have names like Gulliver and Thumbelina, in the later years Voldemort and Harry. And for those of you who are fans of Alaska, The Last Frontier, that little Cupid Eve over there is now one of the stars of that TV show. She is Olga's stepdaughter. And she and Ivan have two little kids that now go out to whale camp, Finley and Sparrow Rose. So the tradition continues. Whale camp is a magical place. In the middle of the night, you wake up and you realize you're hearing the sound of the transient killer whales hunting in the passages. You hear the blow of the humpbacks. You have little tiny hummingbirds that flew all the way from Bolivia to play with the red ribbons on your tent flap. And there's a mama and a daddy eagle, and every year, the whole time we've been there, they've had a couple of chicks, and we've got to watch them, prepare these chicks for life. And we watch the chicks try to fly and fall in the water, and the mom will tow them out again. So it's been a really exciting place to live the last 38 years of our lives. In 2004, our research group, it's a small nonprofit called Winged Whale Research, was part of the massive NOAA effort known as SPLASH to census all the humpbacks in the North Pacific. It was a huge process. Every biologist worked on it. And we were able to ID 1,000 whales along Kenai Fjords and Prince William Sound. And when we looked at the data, we were only able to match 222 of them to their southern migration terminus. We're like, wow, we must not be doing a very good job of looking at the data in Mexico and the data in Hawaii, and maybe there are people that aren't sharing data with us that we need to get. And so I was always looking for more and more data and people, and still the numbers didn't add up. There are a lot of whales missing. And, sometimes you think creatively, and sometimes after the fact you just Monday night quarterback and go, duh. But what is Hawaii, really? It's a seamount. It's an underground range of mountains, volcanic mountains, and they just so happen to stick out of the sea. And we're really happy because of that, because we live on land. Whales could care less whether they stick out of the sea or not, but it turns out whales really like underwater mountains. So people began to look on seamounts, and that's where we're finding the rest of those whales. They migrate pelagically to offshore underwater mountains to breed and to feed. And so now there's a lot of research going in those areas, mostly with unmanned vehicles. Beth, a former colleague, now works for Jupiter Foundation in Hawaii, and she has what are called winged whale vessels that are solar powered and have a full computer load aboard that go out. They follow the route of Magellan, and they're going out to these seamounts now and recording acoustically what they hear. So we'll get some data off the North Pacific seamounts and know how many of these whales, at least acoustically, are breeding there. So when they do go to Baja or Hawaii, the distance is about 3,000 miles. So that's when you start. That's where you start to look on those seamounts, and it takes them about 30 days to swim that far. And the cows and the calves are the slowest, and they leave last, and they arrive last, and they leave Alaska last, and they arrive last in Hawaii, and but it's about a 30-day transition. And when they give birth, the gestation period is between 11 and 12 months, and the baby weighs 1.5 tons to 2.5 tons, and they're born tail first. I always thought that was a mistake. And they eat enormous amounts of milk, 250 gallons a day. And blue whale babies, by the way, grow so fast that if you film them, you can almost see them grow during a certain period of time of their newborn days. They're about 14 feet long, the humpback is, and they, like I said, gather on these seamounts. This is a multi-beam echo sounder look at a seamount. I just thought I'd stick one in there so you could see that we can find them. Now these throat grooves I was talking about that expand the throat, they're really important because these whales eat a ton of food a day. And why it's tricky for me when I'm on the ship to predict where the whales are going to be. There was about 120 humpback whales off San Juan de Fuca entrance 4 weeks ago. The next week we went there, there was about 60, and the following week there were none. And then we went back last week and there were about 30. So what happens? Well, if you eat a ton of food a day, and there are 120 of you, pretty soon there's no food. And they start moving around, and that's why it's hard to predict exactly where these whales are going to be. But you can also extrapolate the tremendous amount of food that's in these waters, and that's because of the cold water and the nature of the plankton bloom. Mostly what they're eating here is capelin and sand lance and small herring bait fish that feed on that plankton. And one of the most dramatic things is to watch them feed. And they have different ways of feeding. One way is called lunge feeding. And I like this picture. It's a cooperative way that whales feed in Prince William Sound a lot because they use each other's bodies to herd the fish. And so they slide their mouth up their buddies' bodies, and the fish are blocked. And so the fish go in, and he closes his mouth and swallows. Works good. They take turns. You can see his tongue really clearly in the roof of the mouth. Along the sides of the roof of the mouth are hairs called baleen, and this is a close-up look at baleen. And what happens is they get this, ton of food, hundreds and hundreds of gallons in one mouthful, and they close their mouth and they drop their tongue and push the water out through the hair, but the food stays inside. Now another way that they feed is called bubble net feeding, and this is a single bubble net. We saw in Southeast Alaska, there was a Southeast Alaska whale visiting some Prince William Sound whales a few years ago. We'd never seen bubble net feeding in Prince William Sound. But we photographed the Southeast Alaska whale, and it was bubble net feeding by itself, making this circle, and they swim around a school of fish, and they let out their bubbles, and they create a net, and then they come underneath it. Well, the next season, all our whales were doing it. They were all bubble net feeding, whether they needed to or not. They thought it was the coolest thing since bicycles. And that's what you might see here in Juneau, except on a far grander scale. Because in Juneau are a group of whales, and there are a number of places around the world that humpbacks do this. A lot of the naturalists in Juneau think this is the only place, but they do it in the Gulf of Maine, they do it in South Africa. But it all depends on how the prey presents itself. So if you have a school of herring the size of this room that's kind of swimming along, and they're real erratic to keep prey at large, and they get in a group because they think they're safer that way, and they're zooming through the water, the whales circle them. But if there's a school this big, you need a lot of whales. So you might have 12, 14, 16 whales, and now we're into the football team mode, because each whale has a position to play, and they each usually play the same position. And they circle the fish, and they swim around in a spiral, letting out their bubbles, and there's strike whales that shoot sound at the fish to further push them together. And they get them as tight as they can go, and they come up underneath them. It looks like this. So when you're out there, You're going to watch the birds. You got a clear area, and all of a sudden birds go, whoop, and they're getting ready to come up, and it's instant. So that's one thing you're looking for. You've located the whales, there's blow, 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 whales all disappear, birds come down. But if you see a bubble come up under your boat, tell the captain, because you don't want to be this guy. This is the dentist in Sitka. Cool, huh? But really it's just a big yellow human toothpick. He didn't get hurt, everybody's always worried, but I love this picture because you can see very clearly the baleen, the frills of the nice side of baleen where he's filtering his food. And believe me, the kayak won't fit through there. I wrote an app on whales. It's in the App Store. Costs 99 cents. It's the new science of whales. I didn't even know what an app was when I wrote it. But you know, I wanted to use all these videos and stuff, and I got a video next of a whale that pretty much does everything a whale can do. I think this is one of the cooler videos I've ever seen. So the first thing he does is he breaches. I think I shot this with my iPhone. And the next thing he does is he's gonna tail slap. This is also called bobtailing. And then he's gonna come up and trumpet. And now he's going to roll over on his back and start slapping the water with his pec fins. Now this whale is not saying hello, but this one is.
Oh my goodness.
That's called spy hopping. And these are the behaviors of a whale, you know, across species. You know, it's like you can use your hand to wave, you can use it to hug, you can punch somebody with it. That's what you can do with that appendage. And so he's showing you what he can do with those appendages, you know. And a whale might tail slap and breach because suddenly you just surprised them. A lot of people notice whales breaching off the stern of a cruise ship. It's because we've surprised them. They go, whoa, what is that? That's bigger than me. They come shooting out of the water. There has to be a reason to throw 45 tons through the air. And then they hit hard and they begin to slap the water, get back, get back, get back. So that's one of the things we're pretty sure of. You know, they're not being aggressive. They're reacting to what they perceive as aggression. Another thing that you might see that sometimes is misinterpreted, the old timers used to think that they wanted to get barnacles off. That was discounted for a really long time, you know, because there was no scientific basis for it. And then there was a bunch of guys in Antarctica from Australia monitoring these killer whales. And in Antarctica, the killer whales, all the whales, turn really deep yellow on that throat groove picture. You saw that yellow color on the jaw of the whale. Those are diatoms. And they'll have a coating of diatoms on them, you know, and we never understood how bad this was for whales. In humpback whales, they always go to the equator pretty much, and they burn them off. But we saw these killer whales in this data these Australians got, and they had transmitters on, and they just abruptly left Australia. And they swam nonstop to the equator. It was like a 9,000-mile trip to the equator, stayed one day, and swam back. And they were covered with cookie cutter bites, and they were bright white. So we think that maybe those diatoms and that knocking the barnacle stuff off might not be so off after all. You know, it's anecdotal information, but, you know, we've had less to go on before. One thing that I always wondered is, you know, what do these guys think about? You know, these whales, how intelligent are they? In the early literature, they were compared to cows. You know, and we didn't know a heck of a lot about it. But a guy at Mount Sinai Hospital started doing necropsies on a bunch of different animals about a decade ago. One of the things you look for when you're looking for intelligence in animals is play behavior. And this is a whale named Quinoa and her calf. And they're playing with a piece of bull kelp. And curiosity is also another point of intelligence in an animal. And so this guy that was doing these necropsies, he was looking at brain cells. And there's this brain cell that humans always thought made us human. And it's called a spindle cell neuron. And we thought only humans had them, because they're the cells that we use to feel layered emotions like empathy and forgiveness and love. And he was looking for spindle cell neurons in other species, and he found them. And so this was my question: can whales fall in love? And he found spindle cell neurons in mountain gorillas and in elephants and in wolves and in these animals that had structured societies. And he found them in the great whales, and he found them in killer whales in abundance, 300 times more than humans commensurate to size and weight. And so they probably can feel layered emotions, and they probably have a rich emotional life, and that's definitely borne out in killer whales in the way they live in these matriarchal pods. And you know, they're studying a lot of things. I don't know, you might have heard about the female in the K1 pod off Vancouver who lost her calf a month ago and carried that dead calf for 2 weeks, you know, as she mourned. She's finally let it go. But we began to really look in our study area, probably because of the way Prince William Sound is laid out in these little bays and stuff, at behavior that we had never read about in the literature. And we were seeing whales that returned year after year, and they would return together. And so we began to look in their southern terminus, and by golly, we found them together in Mexico, and we found them together in Hawaii. And we realized that we were looking at very strong associations between whales. And I remember one night, we were in New Zealand at the International Marine Mammal Conference, and we'd just given our first speed talk on our association study. And all the gods of marine biology, you know, they're all 60 and have white hair, and they're guys. And we were having dinner with a bunch of them, and they were like, no, they're not together because they have a relationship that's so female. They're just there for the food. And I looked at them, they were all from Alaska. I looked at them and I said, yeah, just like us, huh? We're all here for the food. We flew 13,000 miles for the food. You know, no, you know, these guys, of course they eat together and they hunt together, but why were they always together? Why were they sleeping together? Why did they'd be in these groups, and then a stranger would come and they'd react violently to tail slapping and charging and making this stranger go away, and then another whale would swim up and it was like, hey baby, good to see you again. And we watched, and that's how field biology works. And we found out our whales like each other. They like to hang out together. The first time I went out to the Sound, the very first trip, we had some trouble getting out to whale camp, and we ended up anchored off a glacier for the night. We kind of gave up. We'd had a lot of engine trouble and had to tear the engine apart in the middle of Colorado Passage, and you know, we were just tired. So we went to bed, and I woke up the next morning, and there was this horrible smell. I mean, I just couldn't, it was like nothing I'd ever smelled before. And I clambered, and there was this noise, and it was like we were dragging anchor, and I was really discombobulated, and I pushed up the hatch and came up, head up like a turtle looking around, and we were surrounded by sleeping, snoring whales. And whales have the worst breath on the planet. The kids always used to hit the deck and go, incoming! And then the breath would hit me in the face because I'm driving. But they like to sleep together. And so they're all sleeping around us. You know, whales, cetaceans, period, have this adaptation where they are voluntary breathers. We're involuntary breathers. You hit us over the head, we're not going to die. You hit them over the head, they become unconscious, they're probably going to drown. So they have this adaptation where they only sleep one brain hemisphere at a time. So if you put a dolphin on an EEG, you can watch them sleep, and it'll go from this side to this side to this side, you know, with a gap in between. It's pretty cool. There are sleep waves occasionally from both hemispheres, but usually it's asymmetric waves. And so we think that we interpret this to mean that the adaptation to allow them to be vigilant for predators or ship strikes. And then you think about their early ancestors. They were sharing the ocean with like megalodon and stuff, you know, and you needed to be awake and aware. So, And what we also noticed in understanding that these whales like to be together was when we looked at all of our plots over the course of 38 years, we realized that we had two groups of whales, and they didn't intermingle much. And one of those groups had three of the oldest whales that we knew of out in the Sound in that group. And they were always together, and we'd seen this anecdotally for years, but now we decided to look at it statistically. And that group we called the Old Lady Clan. The other clan is named after that first whale, Magellan, so the Magellan clan. And if you look at a simple sociogram, up until the time we did our talk, it was thought that a close association between whales would be about a 0.005. But then we did our study, and it came out looking like this. So Z2, Y5, Z9, and X20, who's an outlier, have these off-the-charts associations, really strong. And it turned out if we plotted them according to decades, that they got stronger and stronger the older the whales got. So what do we know? Old lady whales have lifelong friendships, and they get stronger over time. If you look at all the chart plottings, then you realize, yeah, we were right. We have two different clans of whales, and they don't intermingle much. We also found out that some of the whales, when they go beyond the time when they're breeding, they decide that they don't really need to swim to Hawaii. They're over the La Cucaracha. So they stay in Alaska and eat all winter. Yeah, and those are the big old female whales. And they're just kind of cruising around, you know. And those big whales, the older they get saggy tails and droopy tips. They get way bigger than the males. But the males don't split, you know, they stay with them. You know, in the summer they're always Equipal and Magellan, they're always circling around them. You might be asking yourself how long these darn whales live. Well, you look across filter feeding species, and I can tell you, we think humpbacks live about 100 years. Bowhead whales, on the other hand, those of you have maybe heard of Jean Craighead George. She wrote the wonderful children's books, My Side of the Mountain and Julie of the Wolves. And her son is the chief bowhead biologist in Barrow, Craig George. And Craig thinks, has great anecdotal information about the lifespan of bowhead whales because he's carved prehistoric harpoon points out of tissue in the whales that have been killed by the hunters up there. And some of those harpoon points have been more than 200 years old. So we think bowheads live twice as long as humpback whales. Killer whales can live 80 years in the wild, only about 30 years in captivity, however. There's so many mysteries about whales, none of it's solved, it's all up in the air. For 30 years, if there are any Navy guys out there, let me finish before you go crazy, because I'm going to reveal a top secret thing, but you can't kill me. It's called SCOTUS. That was America's top secret hydrophone array in the Pacific Ocean, but it's not anymore because the Navy gave it to Woods Hole, and now biologists get to share that hydrophone data. And the Navy has some new top secret other thing. And so we got this data, and we learned about a whale they'd been listening to for 30 years. They'd never seen it, but it's called the 52 hertz whale. And it sings at 52 hertz. And the mystery is, there aren't any whales that sing at 52 hertz. So is this a mutant? The only one of its kind? The last of its kind? Look at its schizophrenic migration. Everybody wants to find the 52 hertz whale. One whale that we photographed very early in our nonprofit's history was a whale the kids named Gulliver. And it was a calf, and it had been hit by a ship, and really the fluke almost destroyed. We thought there was no way that this whale could survive. And we see ship strikes and prop scars on lots of whales nowadays because everybody drives too fast, even the whale watching boats. Off Hawaii, they put in a high-speed ferry that goes right through the humpback whale calving areas over there. And this is a whale named after my daughter, Kai. We thought it was a male, or a female, and then it turned out to be a male because it never had a calf. Or maybe it was just too busy eating, because this whale was the one who figured out that if you sat outside of the hatchery and waited with your mouth open, eventually millions of little fish would fly into it. And this whale has been run over so many times, you just cannot believe it. Another whale that didn't fare so well is the Pacific right whale. There are only 31 left in the world, and this whale probably won't make it. And it lives in the Gulf of Alaska. In fact, we saw one this summer. And they're very, very prehistoric filter-feeding whales. And they killed them during hunting days because they were the right whale to kill. They had so much oil and so much fat and muktuk that they floated after they were struck. And of course, whales face a myriad of dangers from the natural world. This whale has been attacked by killer whales. You can see the rake marks on its tail. But man tops the list for sure. And in '89, when the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened, all that oil went right through our study area. And we learned all about oil spills. Now, that was 29 years ago. And today, if you go out on the beach at Latouche Island and dig down 16 inches, you find crude oil. It doesn't ever go away. And the stuff that they used to try and clean the oil almost was worse than the oil itself. There was a tremendous toll, immediate toll, in tens of thousands of killed birds and sea mammals. The humpback whales weren't there, so they were spared direct impact of the oil. But there was a killer whale pod there, a big super pod of transient killer whales. And that transient killer whales, they were heavily oiled. And the result was they had 100% reproductive failure. There's never been another baby killer whale born to that pod of whales. Same thing happened in the Gulf Horizon oil spill to bottlenose dolphins. Those animals that were oiled, they lost the ability to reproduce. So what was once a 300 animal pod, there are only 2 left. So there's a tremendous impact from oil spills. The herring biomass collapsed, and then we did something right as humans. We basically stopped fishing for herring, and all the herring that were out there went to the animals, and that led really to the recovery of that area after the oil spill. But it was commercial whaling that was the biggest problem. And like I said, we hunted whales until there were just no more, and never seeming to realize that this finite resource would disappear. Now we actually swim with whales that were hunted by Yankee whalers, and we find that they're very forgiving indeed. They allow us to approach them and their calves. They let us come near them. And we have a lot more humane ways of studying these whales. We used to shoot them with a crossbow to get a tissue sample, but more and more we see these abscesses on the whales caused by the scientists themselves. And when you're studying endangered species, it's crazy to put them at risk. So now a lot of people have switched from crossbows to whale poop sniffing dogs. This is Tucker. He can find the poop, direct the boat to it, and then once you have it out of the water and compare it on a sample board back on land, he can tell you which whale pooped it.
Oh my God.
We also collect snot with helicopters because you can get genetic information from whale snot. I'm kind of leaving out the orca whales in this deal, but this is a resident orca, and this is one playing with their kid, and this is what happens when you let your kid drive the boat. Yeah, well, we worried about Gulliver. Our kids worried about Gulliver, sorry. And then one year we saw her, and she had a calf, so we had to change her name. And it was the kids that hatched this scheme. Kai came home when she was 8, and she said, "Mom, I don't want any presents this year for my birthday or Christmas. From now on, I want an adventure." And I said, "What adventure?" And she said, "I want you to take me swimming with the biggest creatures that ever lived on Earth. I want to go swimming with a blue whale." And Olga's son, Lars, and Kai had hatched this idea to go find blue whales. And I said, "Honey, we would have to go all the way to Antarctica." And she goes, "Nuh-uh, they're in Baja in January." So sure enough, she talked us into going down to Baja. We stayed in a fancy joint. Came with free scorpions and rattlesnakes. And we rented a boat from a vaquero named Alejo. And we went looking for blue whales, and as fate would have it, on the 3rd day we were there, we saw one. And that was my first sighting of a blue whale. I mean, it came out of the water in sections. And we followed it for a way, but then the kids got really antsy and they just wanted to get in the water with it. So we put on our wetsuits and swam out in the bay. And what happened next was kind of epic. Went down in history in a book called Big Blue that I unfortunately don't have on board, but you can get it on Amazon. They ran out in the middle of the summer. But so we jumped in the water, and the whale, once the boat left, came right to us. And when we dive, it would dive, and it swam right up to my daughter. It had this beautiful eye that you could see the lashes on it, and it went by looking at us as if to say, "Ha! Finally I get to see one of you weirdos up close." You know, it was really gentle, and it circled us a few times. You know, they can make the loudest sound of any living creature on Earth. They can sing across 1,000 miles of ocean, but we can't hear them. I always think of that as such an epic metaphor for humans and nature. But if we record them, then the octaves go up and we can hear them, and they sound like this. What could it mean? So I've gone over my allotted time by 5 minutes, and I will tell you that I have a Q&A time on Friday on Saturday in the piazza at 1:45, and so I'll ask you to save questions because we need questions, otherwise it's really short and boring. But I will be on deck 7 signing books, and thank you very much. Have fun at Juneau.